The British Hermetic Scheme at a glance. This presentation's intended to be just a short introduction to the basic elements of the scheme. In the Hermetic texts from Hellenistic Alexandria, we're given a description of Egypt as being created in the image of the cosmos, but the cosmos in question is actually the solar system, because the sun's described as being in the centre, and each of the gods are identified with particular planets, or rather a particular planet, and then those gods have their sanctuaries at specific locations within the nation. In other words, then we have the sun at the centre, and then the gods have their sanctuaries, their temples, at certain distances, we may assume, from the centre that correspond to the distances of the planets in their orbits around the sun. In the Hermetic texts from Hellenistic Alexandria, we get a description of Egypt as an image of the cosmos, but it's actually the solar system that's described, because we're told that each of the gods have their sanctuaries within the landscape at particular places, while these gods themselves are identified with the planets, and the sun is described as being in the centre within this image. Feeding into this, we have the notion of the balance of the lands, and this concerns a particular mathematical ratio, and it's the one that's shown here. It's actually the same ratio that governs the height where the king's chamber is placed within the Great Pyramid, and it's the same. It's the ratio that divides the square that you can see, which represents the pyramid in plan view, into the grey and white areas, which are actually the same size, the same area. And in Egypt, the city of Memphis, the lower Egyptian capital, was located at this balance of the lands ratio between the capital of Upper Egypt, Thebes, and the north point on the delta. And so we find Memphis known as the balance of the lands repeatedly in Egyptian texts. And interestingly, Thebes was the centre of Amun-Ra, a sun god, while the balance of the lands ratio is also the ratio that we find Venus located with respect to the distance from the Earth to the Sun. So if we take the north point as being Earth, and the centre of the square here as being the Sun, which is, as I've said, appropriate since this is the location sacred to Amun-Ra, then we could wonder about Memphis in connection to Venus. And we know from Herodotus that there was a temple of Venus at Memphis. He calls it a temple of Venus, the mistress of foreign lands, which we know was an epithet for the Egyptian goddess that was equivalent to Venus, which was Hathor. So we have then the beginnings of the type of scheme that we get the description of in the Hermetic texts. So this gives us the basis of our Egyptian Hermetic scheme then. Thebes, the centre of the sun, is in the centre, and then in actual fact, fittingly, the city of Hermopolis, that was the Greek name for the city of Hermes, which was formerly the city of Thoth, the Egyptian equivalent of Hermes, that is actually located within the band that would be the distance of Mercury in its orbit around the Sun. Mercury obviously being the Roman name for Hermes, so Mercury also the name of the planet. As the planet was, of course, named after the god, and I'm going around in circles a little bit. But let's move on to the next slide. So you can probably guess what we're going to do next. We're going to take that basic Hermetic scheme with the planets and their distances from the Sun, and we're going to apply that more locally in Britain. The images we've got up here, we've got that purple line there, by the way, that's the central meridian. That's halfway between the most easterly and westerly points in England, and we've got Silbury Hill and Glastonbury Tor, and the significance of those shall become apparent in a moment. So what we're looking at here then is a line, a straight line, a line of sight extended out across the landscape from the most easterly point, which is Ness Point in Lowestoft, and it actually goes through, as well as another of other sites, it goes straight through the centre of Silbury Hill and right through along the long axis of Glastonbury Tor as well, before continuing on to a point close to the most westerly point of the land, near Land's End. I'm not going to go into too much detail about this line here because we've got a lot else to cover. So what we've got here then is just a simple diagrammatic explanation of how the geodetic scheme that has the foundational line running from East Point to West Point through Silbury Hill and Glastonbury Tor, how that then forms the basis of the a 2x1 rectangle, which is then extended to form a square, and then that is the square within which the image of the cosmos, i.e. solar system, is placed to form our Hermetic scheme. So now we're just going to run through some of the different planetary latitudes that derive from this scheme. And by the way, we're going way beyond anything which the Egyptians themselves could have been aware of. I should perhaps have mentioned before, this is very much a scheme of coincidences, serendipities, synchronicities and the like, rather than something that we're looking at from the historical point of view. So that's what allows us really to go out across the whole globe and look at planets which were not visible to the Egyptians, but to see how with a bit of creativity and an awful lot of help from some good luck, we're able to create quite an extensive, really quite surprisingly elegant scheme. Having said that, there is one part of this which does hint rather intriguingly at some sort of historical scene, and that's what I call the pyramid plan. Now, we've already said that the balance of the lands ratio gives the height of the king, that the king's chamber is placed within the Great Pyramid, and when you look at that line in this scheme, you find it's the line of latitude that connects the two chalk hill figures that take the form of a human figure, the Cernabus giant and the Long Man of Wilmington. So this is rather interesting. Sorry, excuse my little guest I've got with me here. The imagery of these giants is itself quite interesting in this connection, as we'll see next. So to start off, the long man matches very closely certain Egyptian images. We've got an image from well, it's a drawing of an image from the ceiling of an Egyptian temple here, of a figure holding two serpents and looking very much like the long man with his two poles. Got some more images here which resemble the long man. You can see the ankh symbol there, that figure like a cross with a loop at the top. That's shown here as what's called an animated ankh. That means it's got arms and the hands are holding two sceptres, looking very much like the long man with his two staffs. And in the bottom image there we can see the god Thoth shown with his ibis head. That's one of the forms he took. And the two staffs he's holding have iconography which show they represent Upper and Lower Egypt. We've got the flower and the papyrus, and we've got the crown of Upper Egypt, the crown of Lower Egypt, and the two cobras around them are the two cobra goddesses of Upper and Lower Egypt. So demonstrating quite clearly that two staffs can represent upper and lower regions. And then on the right there we've got the ankh with the wasp sceptres, and it's shown there with two weights hanging down from the elbows. This resembles Egyptian depictions of scales, showing here that this must represent the wasp sceptre represents dominions, so this must represent the two dominions of Upper and Lower Egypt being held in balance. So it's an image therefore of the balance of the lands. So we've got the long man there with similar imagery and himself being located at the balance of the land, so it all seems rather appropriate. From this then we get the image of, or the idea of the British pyramid plan, and this very much concerns the other chalk giant as well. So we've got here an image of the pyramid plan, the cross-section of the Great Pyramid, showing the internal chambers, and the Cernabus giant here is in exactly the location of the point where the so-called Orion shaft enters the king's chamber. Now, of course, the triangle shown here has got a 45-degree angle slope because it's the diagonal of a square, because we're showing the pyramid in plan view, really. Remember, the square itself is the pyramid in plan view, whereas the cross-section, of course, is a side view. So in the side view, of course, the slope angle of the pyramid is not 45 degrees, but what you've got here is an example of the mixing up of different perspectives, different viewpoints, which was very common in Egyptian art, as you probably know. For example, in the image on the right there, that's an Egyptian image of a pond in plan view, but various details such as the trees around the pond are shown in side view. And this was a way they used to mix up different perspectives. So it's really just an example of that. The reason it's called the Orion shaft, of course, is that this shaft is directed up into the sky, or towards the sky, such that in the Pyramid Age, when the pyramid was constructed, it was aimed directly at the point where Orion's belt, the 3 stars of Orion's belt, culminated, in other words, reached their highest position due south in the sky. Now, we obviously see Orion as a man with a club, very much like the Cernabus giant, with the other arm extended up to his side. And as I investigate on a page on this site, this derives from the Egyptian image of the Ka, or spirit double, of the king hunting with a throwing stick in the marshes of the afterlife. This is just an image showing more accurately some of the key locations here. So we've got the balance of the land's latitude running along the King's Chamber floor level. You can see the sarcophagus there within the King's Chamber. And you can also see the point there where the shaft goes horizontal to enter the King's Chamber, and that is the location of the Cerberus giant. Now, in the north of England, there's another site that's associated with Orion's belt, because it looks like Orion's belt. It consists of three large double henges, and one of them is slightly offset from the line of the other, just as with Orion's belt, and indeed with the three pyramids of Giza, which again have been linked to Orion's belt. And this is of particular significance here with respect to the pyramid plan, as we shall see in the next slide. So now we're interested in the northern equivalent of the pyramid plan, and so we've got the rotated pyramid plan around the apex at the centre of the pattern, and then on the right here you can see once again the balance of the land's latitude, and you can see the what we could call the Orion point longitude, being, in other words, where the shaft enters the chamber, and you can see that point there is pretty much in a good line with the three Thornbow henges, but those henges themselves are part of a bigger megalithic landscape complex, which includes other henges of the same type, including we can see there Hutton Moor is exactly on the balance of the land's latitude, and then we've also got Carnarvon very close to our intersection point of that with the Orion point latitude. A further rotation brings us to the eastern equivalent of the pyramid plan, and we've again got a megalithic, a Neolithic landscape complex featuring a cursus and henges, and this one is around the area of the Fornham cursus near Bury St Edmunds, which we're actually looking here at the position of the sarcophagus within the King's Chamber, but we don't want to dwell too much on the pyramid plan here, so let's move on to the next slide. Okay, so having looked a little bit there at the pyramid plan, now going back from what seems to be a historical level to back to this this realm of synchronicities and lucky coincidences, and again we're looking at the Hermetic plan, the planetary latitude bands that extend across the globe from our scheme. Right, so the Saturn band takes us to the region of the Canary Islands, which classical authors associated with or identified as the Fortunate Isles, the Blessed Isles, which indeed was, according to other classical sources, the location of the Tower of Saturn, and it was the place where Saturn, or the Greek name Kronos, that's where he went to in his retirement, you could say, when he was no longer the ruler of the gods, and he went to rule this sort of Golden Age type location on the Blessed Isles, so that's all rather fitting. We can see here in the diagram here we've got the maximum, in other words the outer orbit distance going through. You can see going through Tenerife and going through the middle of the Canary Islands there. So that's the first latitude coincidence we're looking at here. And we move on to look at Jupiter, and we can see the maximum Jupiter orbit distance that goes very close to the site of Dodona, which ancient sources very explicitly identify as a site sacred to Jupiter, or the Greek name Zeus. And then the mean Jupiter orbit distance we've got going through the site of Dion, where there was a great temple of Zeus at the foot of Mount Olympus, and Mount Olympus itself being the location of the great palace of Jupiter, where he entertained all the gods. So this is looking pretty good. Just an image here of the site of Dodona, with Mount Tomoros on the horizon there. Now the asteroid groups known as the Trojans and the Greek Trojans, in other words the Greeks that went to Troy to fight in the Trojan War, these actually correspond to a latitude band where we actually find the site of ancient Troy. And if we read the Iliad, we find various descriptions of the soldiers using boulders when nothing else was to hand to fight each other. So it's quite neat to see these as the asteroids. Another group from classical mythology that was famous for using boulders when fighting others was the centaurs. And there's a class of asteroid known as a centaur asteroid, which again works well in the scheme. The innermost orbit distance corresponds to the latitude of the mountain which was said to be the home of the centaurs. That's Mount Pelion in Greece, shown in the photograph here. So that's still looking pretty good. Now the middle Mars orbit distance. This is where we really do see things starting to get extremely neat indeed. It goes right through the centre of the field of Mars, the Champ de Mars, Champ de Mars in the centre of Paris. That's the place where the Eiffel Tower is, and it's an idea that was based on the Roman field of Mars in Rome, which was actually a pleasure ground. Mars, for the Romans, as well as being obviously a god of war, was also the keeper of the peace. It's particularly, in the Augustan period, the Pax Romana, the unification of the empire under one central authority was seen as having, and indeed it did create peace. And that's why you get this seemingly rather odd idea of Mars being the god of a sort of peaceful pleasure ground. And then on the right here you can see there's a statue of Mars on the large classical building, the Hôtel des Invalides in this region of Paris. And then below that there's another statue of Mars and Hygeia on the Fountain of Mars, again in this region in the centre of Paris. Coming to the Earth latitudes, inner, middle and outer, these go through West Penwith, the region, the far western tip of Cornwall, and this is a region which has specifically been identified as the landscape of the Earth goddess by New Age groups, and you can see there's a book there by Cheryl Straffon, Pagan Cornwall, Land of the Goddess, something you can look into online, and various cyclopean and megalithic sites there, which we can see as being linked to this earthy tradition. Now this is an absolutely fascinating one. We're coming to the Neptune latitude here. Neptune being Poseidon for the Greeks, of course. Now the mean Neptune distance goes right through Lake Pupo in Bolivia, and this is the location that's been identified as Atlantis by Jim Allen, his book on the bottom left there. And we are, of course, once again on the level of coincidence here. I'm not saying yay or nay as to whether this is the historical Atlantis. I'm just fascinated that a site that has been mythologized, if you like, at the very least in modern times as being Atlantis, now turns up right where we'd expected in the scheme. Repeatedly, Plato, our source on Atlantis, repeatedly describes Atlantis as being the zone, or in the zone of Poseidon, temple of Poseidon in the center of Atlantis, and repeated references to Poseidon. It's described as being his sanctuary, if you like, on the earth. Looking here at the Venus latitudes in the south coast of England, and particularly interesting site here. The outer Venus latitude goes right through the site of Osborne House, Queen Victoria's sort of holiday home on the Isle of Wight, and it's full of statues of Venus. Interestingly, it seems to be the dominant theme there. And even as we see on the left there, one of them being an ancient marble statue of Venus. This one, she's known here as the Marine Venus. So this is kind of, if you like, the palace of Venus or Aphrodite on the island, the Isle of Wight. A couple more of the Venus statues here to the left, and then the right. There's just a painting of the corridor, which contains the ancient marble Venus statue in a niche to the left there, a scallop shell niche, fittingly enough. Moving on to Mercury now, or Hermes, to give him his Greek name, and you can see here a statue of Mercury from Cliveden, the site of Cliveden by the Thames, in the Arcadian Ilex Grove. And Cliveden House itself is right at the exactly at the mean or middle Mercury orbit distance in the scheme. Cliveden also has a couple of ancient Egyptian statues of Thoth as a baboon. You can see them placed there in the same configuration as the two giant statues of Thoth still in Egypt on the site of Hermopolis. Thoth being, of course, the god who was the equivalent of Hermes or Mercury, and Hermopolis being his city. As you may recall, we earlier identified that the location of Hermopolis as being within the Mercury or Hermes zone in the Egyptian Hermetic scheme. Now we've got those two Thoth statues at the middle Mercury distance in the British Egyptian scheme. So we've got Cliveden, if you like, as the British Hermopolis by the Thames, being the English Nile, if you like. Now the inner Mercury orbit distance goes right, very close to, almost through the site of Tom Quad in Christchurch College, Oxford. And in the centre of the quad is a pond, and in the centre of that pond is a statue of Mercury. So it's another nice coincidence there. And of course, Hermes Mercury, the god of academies, of learning, of educating the youth, as well as athletic fitness. All rather suitable for a sanctuary of Thoth, Hermes Mercury, or Nabu, to give him his Babylonian name. again identified with the planet. So you might be wondering, where's the outer orbit latitude in the scheme? Well, it actually goes through a site that's not on the Thames. So we had Cliveden and Oxford, obviously, like all the Egyptian sites, next to the equivalent of the Nile. This one is on the River Avon, the site of Bath, the old classical location, of course. And here we see a statue of Hermes with his winged hat and so on top of a bank, god of trade, of course, as well, in the centre of Bath. The latitude line itself actually goes through the northern half of Bath, and it passes right through the site of the garden of Prior Park House, if you're interested. So then we come on to the planet Uranus. Difficult one in many ways because we don't know that much about this Greek god. We know he's a sky god, we know he was a rain god, and we know a little bit of the etymological root there. We know it comes from the same root as the English word rain, and indeed what is suspected to be a related god, the Indian god Varuna, again a water god. We find obviously temples, sanctuaries, shrines of Varuna in all across India, including in southern India, in Kerala. And the coastline along here was said, there's a myth, a certain figure had to throw an axe and was told by the god Varuna that earth would rise from the sea as far as he could throw the axe. And so we have, in this sense, the southern tip of India was raised from the sea by Varuna. And the reason I'm mentioning that, of course, as you can see in the diagram, the middle, the inner orbit distance corresponds to Kerala in southern India. Now, this is a particular favourite of mine, this one, another very neat correspondence here. The Hilda's asteroid group is at the latitude that includes the Crau Plain in the south of France. Now this group of asteroids, we know it moves in a resonance with a 3-2 resonance with Jupiter. So in that sense, it's a field of asteroids that is orchestrated, directed by Jupiter. And in myth, we know from Greek myth, this site, because it's littered with large boulders or, well, rounded stones, it being a floodplain in ancient times, very ancient times, it was mythologized as the place where Jupiter had sent a shower of stones in order that Heracles would have something to use as ammunition when attacked by bandits as he was passing through on one of his 12 labours. So again, we have the stones directed, orchestrated in a large group by Jupiter. So it does seem to fit extraordinarily well. Another lovely coincidence, in other words. Now, if you go out to the outer orbit regions of the outer planet Eris, then you come to Antarctica. Eris being, of course, the goddess of chaos, of discord, and this region inhospitable to not completely inhospitable to life, but I think you know what I'm getting at. Seems rather appropriate in many ways. You're also getting out to the coldest regions of the solar system out there as well. And I haven't even mentioned here the northern equivalent. So going from that central solar latitude, you can extend it northwards and find similar coincidences. You'll have to look on the site here to find more detail, but just briefly, we get Iceland as the location of Jupiter, Thor being the Nordic Jupiter as a god of the thunder and the oak, That's why we've got Thursday in Italian and French. That's known as Jupiter's Day. So that's why they made Thursday Thor's Day, because they recognised that Thor was the direct equivalent of Jupiter. And in Icelandic tradition, close to the mean latitude, you've got a site of Helgafell, which is the equivalent of the palace of Olympus. It's where Thor sort of feasts eternally within this great hill in a great feasting hall. So again, very neat. Saturn, also another neat one there, because ancient sources, classical sources, describe the frozen sea to the north as being the Sea of Saturn. And indeed, you are getting up there. You can see you're up past Iceland, up going through the centre of Greenland. There, you're getting up into the Arctic Circle to the regions of the frozen sea. We'll leave that for the moment. Have a look at the various pages on the site for more details about the northern scheme. And just briefly returning again to the centre, close to the centre of that geodetic square in England, you've got the Balaji temple, the temple of Vishnu, that tower, Sakkara Tower in the centre there. Those towers are mythologized as being the kind of central axis around which the heavenly bodies rotate. Which is exactly what we'd hope for, really, for the centre of our scheme, because that's how we're seeing that point. This, incidentally, I believe, at least when I last looked into it, the largest Hindu temple complex in Europe, I think. Well worth a visit if you're in the